What if everything you thought was safe suddenly shattered before your eyes? Mona's life was about to change forever and nothing could have prepared her for what happened next. Watch until the end to witness the moment that left everyone speechless. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe to support the channel. Your support keeps these powerful stories alive. Mona sat at the edge of her bed, her small hands gripping the blanket tightly as she gazed out of the window. The gray clouds outside mirrored the heaviness in her heart. It was another school day and the thought of stepping into the building filled her with dread. Her eyes shifted to the door, half expecting her mother to call her for breakfast, but she didn't move. Her heart pounded in her chest like a drum, every beat echoing the anxiety that had been building for weeks. School had never been a safe place for Mona. From the moment she stepped through the gates, the whispers would start soft at first, like the rustle of leaves, but growing louder as she walked down the hallway. Her classmates' eyes followed her like vultures circling prey. Look at her hair, one girl sneered. Why does she look like that? Mona kept her head down, gripping the straps of her backpack so tightly that her knuckles turned white. It didn't matter how many times she told herself to stay strong, the words always found a way, and lunch was no better. As she sat alone in the corner of the cafeteria, she felt the stares burning into her back. She could hear them laughing, hear them pointing, and every now and then someone would accidentally bump into her, spilling her juice or knocking her tray to the ground. The teachers saw, they always saw, but they never did anything. Some glanced at her with pity while others acted as if nothing had happened. It hurt more than the words. At least words had an end, but their silence lingered. Mona's heart ached every day she walked home. Her feet shuffled along the familiar path, her head low, her shoulders slouched. She didn't want her parents to see how broken she felt. Her mother would ask, "How was school, sweetheart?" and Mona would reply with the same lie every time. It was fine, but her eyes betrayed her. Her mother noticed, but before she could press further, Mona would disappear into her room, shutting the door behind her. It wasn't her parents she wanted to see after school. It was her grandmother. Every other day her grandmother would visit their house and Mona felt an unspoken warmth fill the air. Her grandmother, with her soft hands and steady eyes, always knew when something was wrong. "Come here, baby," she'd say, arms wide open, her voice as smooth as honey. Mona would fall into that hug, letting out all the pain she bottled up throughout the day. No words were needed. Her grandmother's embrace was enough. That afternoon, after another unbearable day at school, Mona came home to the smell of freshly baked bread. Her grandmother was in the kitchen humming a familiar song as she kneaded dough. Her hands moved with purpose, strong yet gentle, like she could turn something broken into something whole. "There's my baby," her grandmother said, glancing over her shoulder with a smile that could melt glaciers. Mona's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away, not wanting to show how much it hurt. "Bad day?" her grandmother asked as she wiped her hands on a cloth. She sat at the kitchen table, patting the chair next to her. Mona hesitated, then slowly walked over and sat down. Her grandmother's eyes full of patience met hers. "You know you can tell me, right?" Mona stared at the table, picking at a loose thread on her sweater. "It's just school," she muttered. Her grandmother leaned in, her gaze unwavering. "School, huh? Sounds like more than that." Mona stayed silent, her throat tight with emotion. Her grandmother reached over, placing a hand on top of hers. "They don't know you, baby," she said softly, her voice firm but kind. "They don't know how smart you are, how strong you are. They don't see you the way I do, but one day they will." Mona's eyes lifted, her vision blurred with tears. "But it hurts, Grandma," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Every day it hurts." Her grandmother nodded slowly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Pain doesn't mean you're weak," she said, her eyes narrowing with resolve. "Pain means you're alive, and if you're alive you can fight. Do you hear me, baby? You can fight." Mona nodded, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. Her grandmother smiled, pulling her into a hug. "That's my girl, you're stronger than you think." The days followed the same painful rhythm. School was the war zone and Mona was the target. Her classmates pushed her, laughed at her, called her names too cruel to repeat. One day during recess, a group of them surrounded her. One girl grabbed her bag and dumped everything out onto the ground: books, notebooks, pencils, everything scattered like leaves in the wind. "Pick it up, freak," one boy said, kicking her notebook away. Mona bent down, heart pounding, fighting the tears that threatened to spill. Her fingers trembled as she reached for her things, but every time she got close one of them kicked it further away. The laughter echoed in her ears louder than any bell. "Leave me alone," she muttered under her breath, but her voice was too quiet. No one listened. That night she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her grandmother's words replayed in her mind like a melody. "If you're alive you can fight." But how could she fight when every day she felt more and more like a ghost? The world didn't see her, her teachers ignored her, her classmates hated her, and even her parents couldn't see the weight she carried. She clutched her blanket to her chest, squeezing her eyes shut as silent tears rolled down her cheeks. The next day she didn't want to go to school. Her mother knocked on her door. Mona, you're going to be late, sweetie. But Mona didn't move. She buried herself deeper under the covers, her heart heavy with dread. Her mother knocked again, this time more firmly. Mona, get up, you can't miss school. But Mona didn't reply. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind, urging her to fight. Slowly she sat up, wiping the tears from her eyes. When she arrived at school, the stairs started again. Her heart pounded, but she kept walking, one step then another. Her fingers tightened on her backpack straps. She repeated the words in her head over and over. I'm strong, I'm strong, I'm strong. Her grandmother's voice echoed alongside hers. They don't see you the way I do. But that day something different happened. During lunch, sat alone at her usual spot. Her grandmother appeared, not physically but in her heart. Mona imagined her grandmother's voice saying, don't let them win, baby. She sat up straighter, wiping her eyes. It wasn't much, but for the first time in a long time she felt like she could breathe. That evening as she walked home, she spotted her grandmother sitting on the porch swing. Her grandmother waved, her face lighting up like a sunrise. Look at you, her grandmother said with pride. You didn't let them win today, did you? Mona shook her head, feeling a small flicker of hope. Her grandmother held her arms wide and Mona ran into them, sinking into that warmth, that safety. Her grandmother kissed the top of her head. That's my girl. That night Mona didn't cry herself to sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the house. Her grandmother's words echoed in her heart like a song she never wanted to forget. You're stronger than you think. For the first time in a long time she believed it. The next day school still felt heavy, but Mona walked in with her head held higher than before. Her class stared, but she didn't look away. Their words stung, but she didn't crumble. She didn't have to face them alone anymore. She had her grandmother's love wrapped around her like armor. When she got home, her grandmother was already there waiting for her with open arms. How was school, baby? She asked, her eyes filled with love. Mona smiled softly, leaning into her grandmother's embrace. It was hard, she admitted, but I'm still here. Her grandmother kissed her forehead and smiled. Yes, baby, you're still here. The days grew heavier for Mona, each one a mirror of the last. The weight of school bore down on her like an unshakable shadow. She woke up each morning with a knot of anxiety twisting in her chest, her eyes dull with exhaustion. Every step toward school felt like walking deeper into a storm she couldn't escape. The hallways were battlegrounds and she was outnumbered. Every time the whispers grew louder, the laughter cut deeper. Her classmates' eyes followed her like wolves tracking prey. One particular morning Mona walked through the school doors with her head down, hoping to remain unseen, but she knew that was impossible. Her heart thudded in her chest as the first insult hit her ears. Look at her, still wearing that same old sweater. Must be nice to be poor and ugly. Another voice chimed in. Laughter erupted. Mona kept her head down, pretending she didn't hear. Her fingers gripped her backpack straps, nails pressing into her palms. Don't cry, she told herself. Don't give them the satisfaction. But the tears prickled her eyes anyway. Her desk in class was no safe haven. Scribbled on its surface were the words freak and go back where you came from, written in the permanent marker. She sat down slowly, her eyes fixed on the floor. Her teacher walked in but didn't even glance at the desk. Mona glanced up silently, pleading for her to see it, to do something, but the teacher turned toward the board and began the lesson as if nothing had happened. Mona felt something sharp twist inside her chest. She wanted to scream, to stand up and shout, don't you see this? Can't you see what they're doing to me? But she didn't. She stayed silent. Her voice felt trapped in her throat like a bird with clipped wings. Lunchtime was even worse. She sat in the corner of the cafeteria like she always did, tray in front of her, head bowed. She picked at her food, but her appetite was gone. She knew what was coming before it even happened. It always happened. A hand slapped the side of her tray, spilling her food across the table. Gasps and snickers filled the room. Oops, one of the boys sneered, holding up his hands like it was an accident. My bad. Everyone laughed. Mona's heart dropped into her stomach. Her face burned with shame. Her hands shook as she reached for a napkin, trying to clean up the mess. Don't cry, she told herself. Don't cry, but she couldn't stop the tears from welling in her eyes. That evening she walked home slower than usual, her feet dragging across the pavement. Her mind replayed every moment of the day like a broken record. She couldn't turn off the spilled lunch, the words on her desk, the laughter. It echoed in her mind louder than anything else. She felt so small. She could hear her mother's voice in her head saying, how was school, sweetheart? She didn't want to lie again, but she didn't want to tell the truth either. She hated that question, but something changed when she reached home. The smell of warm bread drifted through the air. Her heart lifted a little. She could hear soft music playing from the kitchen, the familiar hum of her grandmother's voice singing an old tune. It was one of those songs that didn't need lyrics to be understood. It was love and peace in melody form. Mona opened the door and was greeted by her grandmother's voice. There's my baby, she called out, her eyes lighting up as At the sight of her granddaughter, Mona's lip trembled. She didn't want to cry, not in front of her, but the moment she saw her grandmother's open arms, something inside her broke. She dropped her bag by the door and rushed into the warmth of her grandmother's hug. "Oh baby," her grandmother whispered, her hands rubbing circles on Mona's back. "Let it out, just let it out," Mona sobbed, burying her face into her grandmother's shoulder. Every tear she'd held back at school came rushing out in waves. "I hate it there, Grandma," she cried. "I hate it so much." Her grandmother didn't say a word at first. She just held her tighter, rocking her gently like she did when Mona was little. "I know baby," she whispered, "I know." Later that evening they sat at the kitchen table. Her grandmother poured them both a cup of warm tea, the steam rising softly between them. Mona's eyes were still puffy from crying, but she felt lighter. Her grandmother sat across from her, her chin resting on her hands. "You know," she started, her voice slow and thoughtful, "you remind me of me when I was your age." Mona frowned. "You?" she asked, genuinely surprised. Her grandmother chuckled. "Yes, me," she said, raising an eyebrow. "Don't act so shocked. I wasn't always this old, you know." Her grandmother leaned forward, her eyes full of stories waiting to be told. "They used to call me names too," she said softly. "They told me I wasn't good enough, that I didn't belong, but you know what I learned?" She paused, letting the words settle. "I learned that they only say those things because they're scared of what makes you different, but being different isn't a curse, baby, it's a gift." Mona stared into her tea, watching the ripples move across the surface. "It doesn't feel like a gift," she muttered. Her grandmother reached across the table and took her hand. "That's because you're still growing into it," she said. "You're still learning to see it." "But I see it, baby, I see you." Those words sat in Mona's chest like a small flame. For the first time in a long time she didn't feel invisible. The next few days at school were no different. The same taunts, the same laughter, but something had changed in Mona. Every time she heard them call her names, she heard her grandmother's voice right alongside it. "I see you." Those words became her shield. She still felt the hurt, but it didn't cut as deep as before, and that was something. Then it happened. The day everything changed. It started like any other. Mona walked into school, head down, hands gripping her bag. She tried to make herself small, unnoticed, but at lunch a boy named Jared decided he wanted to make her a target. "Hey freak," he called out. Mona tensed but kept walking. She knew better than to respond, but Jared wasn't done. He walked up behind her and yanked her backpack so hard that she stumbled forward, her tray of food crashing to the ground. Laughter erupted around her. Her heart pounded in her ears. She crouched down, trying to pick up her spilled lunch, but her hands shook too much. Tears blurred her vision. "What's wrong, freak?" Jay sneered. "Cat got your tongue." The whole cafeteria erupted in laughter. Her face felt hot, her chest tight with rage and shame. She couldn't take it anymore. She stood up slowly, her eyes locked on Jared. She clenched her fists so tightly her nails dug into her palms. Her breathing grew heavy, her heart pounding so hard it echoed in her ears. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. "If you're alive, you can fight." Her voice, strong and clear, pushed her forward. Mona's eyes, once filled with fear, were now steady and sharp. Jared took a step back, his grin faltering. "What's wrong?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling but firm. "Not so funny now, huh?" The cafeteria fell silent. Her eyes didn't leave his. Her heart pounded like a drum, steady and powerful. "Jared Sky, you think you're tough now?" he sneered, his voice less sure than before. "You think anyone cares about you?" He laughed, but it sounded hollow. Mona didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The silence around them was louder than any insult he could throw at her. She crouched down, slowly picking up her tray, never taking her eyes off him. She didn't cry, she didn't run, and for the first time she didn't feel small. That night when she got home, her grandmother was waiting at the kitchen table, a smile tugging at her lips. "You fought today, didn't you?" her grandmother asked knowingly. Mona blinked, unsure how she knew. "I didn't fight," she said softly, setting her bag down. Her grandmother tilted her head. "Yes you did," she said with pride, "and I'm proud of you." Mona sat down at the table, a small smile forming on her face. For the first time she believed her grandmother's words. "I'm proud of you," echoed in her heart. She was still standing, she was still here. The morning sun seeped through the blinds, casting thin rays of light across Mona's face. Her eyes flickered open, heavy with sleep and dread. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling that same familiar weight settle on her chest. The thought of another day at school made her stomach twist. She knew what was waiting for her: the stares, the whispers, the laughter. Her breath came in short, shallow gulps as the anxiety built inside her. Her mother's voice echoed from the kitchen, calling her for breakfast. "Mona, come eat before you're Late she sat up slowly, her body feeling heavier than usual. Her fingers traced the edges of her blanket as she tried to summon the strength to move. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind, "If you're alive you can't fight." The words circled in her head, but today they felt distant, harder to believe. She dragged herself out of bed, her feet cold against the hardwood floor at the breakfast table. Her father was flipping through the newspaper while her mother placed a plate of eggs and toast in front of her. "Eat up, baby," her mother said, brushing her fingers across Mona's hair. Her father glanced up from his newspaper, his eyes narrowing. "You look tired, Mona. Everything all right?" Her breath hitched. She nodded quickly, stabbing at her eggs with her fork. "I'm fine," she muttered, her voice barely audible. Her parents exchanged a glance, but neither of them pressed further. Her grandmother arrived a little later, carrying her favorite basket filled with fresh bread and sweet rolls. As soon as Mona saw her, she felt the smallest flicker of warmth in her chest. "There's my baby," her grandmother said with a smile as she sat next to her. "Look at you, all quiet today. What's on your mind?" Mona hesitated, eyes flicking to her parents then back to her plate. "Nothing," she mumbled. Her grandmother tilted her head, her sharp eyes studying Mona like she could see right through her. Her grandmother hummed, leaning in closer. "Well, when you're ready to talk, I'm right here." The bus ride to school felt longer than usual. The hum of the engine buzzed in her ears as she pressed her forehead against the window. Her classmates chatted and laughed behind her, their voices loud and carefree. She sat alone, clutching her bag to her chest. Her reflection in the window stared back at her, tired eyes, tense shoulders, a face that didn't belong, invisible. She thought, "They don't see me." Not really. She closed her eyes, wishing she could disappear for just one day. As soon as she stepped through the school doors, she felt the shift in the air. Eyes followed her, whispers trailed behind her. "There she is," someone muttered. Her heart pounded, her pace quick. "And just get to class, just get to class." But fate had other plans. 3 girls were waiting for her near the lockers. They leaned against the metal doors like they owned the place. Their eyes locked on Mona. The moment she appeared, her steps slowed, her breath hitched. "Look who finally decided to show up," one of them sneered, stepping into Mona's path. Her name was Kayla, and she had the kind of voice that dripped with cruelty. The 2 girls behind her snickered. Mona kept her eyes on the ground, trying to walk around them, but Kayla stepped in front of her again, blocking her way. "What, too good to say hello?" she asked, tilting her head with a mocking grin. Mona clenched her jaw, gripping the straps of her bag tighter. "Just leave me alone," she muttered. "Oh, she talks now," Kayla said, her eyes lighting up with mock excitement. "I thought freaks weren't supposed to talk." Her friends burst into laughter. Mona's heart raced. Her palms felt sweaty. She glanced around, searching for a teacher or anyone who might help, but no one looked. No one ever looked. "They don't see me, they never see me." Suddenly Kayla reached forward and snatched Mona's bag off her shoulder. "Hey!" Mona gasped, spinning around to grab it back, but Kayla tossed it to one of the other girls. "Catch!" The girl caught it and ran down the hallway, laughing as she unzipped the bag and dumped its contents onto the floor. Books, papers and pencils scattered everywhere. The laughter grew louder. Mona's breath came out in short gasps, panic rising like a tide. "Stop it!" she yelled, her voice cracking. "Just stop, make us," Kayla said with a shrug, her smirk unwavering. Mona's eyes darted to her books on the floor. Her sketch pad lay open, her drawings visible for everyone to see. One of the girls crouched down, flipping through it. "Wow, look at this," she said with mock admiration. "She thinks she's an artist." She ripped out one of the pages, crumpling it in her fist. "Oops!" Mona's vision blurred with tears, her chest heaved with anger and pain. Her feet felt glued to the floor. Every part of her screamed to move, to grab her sketch pad, to fight back, but her body wouldn't listen. Her hands trembled at her sides, her heart pounded so hard it hurt. "I can't do this, I can't do this anymore." The bell rang, but the girls didn't move. They stared at Mona, daring her to do something. Her breath hitched, her legs wobbled, her vision blurred as tears filled her eyes. She turned and ran. She didn't stop running. She ran past the classrooms, past the cafeteria, past the teachers who pretended not to see. She ran out the back doors of the school, her feet pounding against the pavement. Her breath came in sharp gasps. Her heart felt like it was about to explode. She didn't know where she was running, but she didn't care. She just needed to get away. She kept running until she saw the large oak tree at the edge of the field. Her knees buckled and she fell to the ground, her hands pressed into the dirt, her chest heaving with sobs. She didn't care who saw her anymore. She didn't care if they laughed. She was tired of being strong. She was tired of pretending she was okay. She buried her face in her arms and cried. Her body shook with each sob, every tear soaking into the dirt beneath her. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. She wasn't sure. The sun had shifted and the sky, its light peeking through the branches of the oak tree. Footsteps scrunched behind her, her heart clenched, fear spiking through her chest. She didn't look up. She didn't want to see who it was, but then she heard the soft voice she knew so well. "Baby," her grandmother said gently. Mona's sobs grew louder. Her grandmother crouched beside her, placing a hand on her back. "It's okay, baby, it's okay." Mona sat up, wiping her face with shaky hands. Her cheeks were stained with dirt and tears. Her grandmother pulled her into a hug, squeezing her tightly. "They won't break you," she whispered into Mona's hair. "They think they're strong, but they don't know real strength. Real strength is getting back up, baby. Real strength is coming home." Mona's sobs slowly faded into quiet sniffles. She clung to her grandmother like she was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. That night Mona barely spoke at dinner. Her parents exchanged worried glances. Her grandmother sat beside her, rubbing her back in slow soothing circles. "I'm proud of you," her grandmother said softly. Mona didn't understand. "I ran away," she muttered, her voice cracking. "I didn't do anything." Her grandmother leaned down, her eyes filled with pride. "You're still here," she said firmly, "and as long as you're still here, you're winning." Later that night Mona sat in bed staring at the ceiling. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. "You're still here." Her chest still hurt, her eyes were still swollen, but for the first time she felt a small spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The next day at school her hands still shook, her heart still pounded, but she walked into that building with her head just a little higher. When Kayla saw her, she rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath. Mona heard it but didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed forward. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. "They think they're strong, but they don't know real strength." Her heart still ached, her hands still trembled, but she kept walking. The world outside the hospital window seemed distant and muted, like it belonged to another reality. The soft beeping of machines echoed through the sterile white room, an endless reminder of the fragile line between life and death. Mona lay motionless on the hospital bed, her small frame barely visible beneath the layers of blankets. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow, assisted by the steady rhythm of the ventilator attached to her face. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting a pale glow on her skin. Her mother sat beside her, clutching Mona's hand with both of hers, her fingers trembling. Tears streaked her cheeks as she stared at her daughter's still face, her lips moving in silent prayers that had no end. Her father paced back and forth at the edge of the room, his jaw tight, his eyes filled with a mix of frustration and helplessness. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, his heart ached with the weight of guilt, regret and fear. The doctor stood at the foot of the bed, his expression grim. He spoke slowly, carefully choosing his words, but nothing he said could soften the blow. "We've done everything we can," he began, his eyes darting between Mona's parents. "Her vitals are weak and there's minimal brain activity. We've run all the tests," and he paused, his lips pressing into a thin line. "At this point it's unlikely she'll wake up." Mona's mother gasped, her sobs escaping in sharp, jagged breaths. Her body shook as she leaned over her daughter, brushing her fingers through Mona's hair as if the touch alone could bring her back. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no, please." Her father stopped pacing, his body stiff and his eyes fixed on the doctor. "So that's it?" he asked, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "You're just giving up on her?" The doctor shook his head, his voice calm but firm. "I understand how difficult this is, Mr. Taylor, but we have to be realistic. Her body is functioning only because of the machines. If we see no improvement over the next 48 hours, we may need to discuss." He glanced at Mona's mother, who was already shaking her head in refusal. "No," she said again, louder this time. "Don't you dare finish that sentence." Her voice cracked, but the fire in her eyes was undeniable. "My baby is still here. I can feel it. She's still here." Her husband stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. His face was tight with pain, but his eyes held the same resolve. "We're not giving up on her," he said, his voice low but firm. "We're not." The doctor nodded slowly, his face softening. "I'll give you some time," he said, and then he quietly left the room. For a long moment the room was silent except for the steady hum of the machines. The weight of the doctor's words hung in the air like an unspoken curse. Mona's mother sat in her chair, her face buried in her hands, while her father stood by the window, his eyes distant. The faint sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, soft at first, then closer, until they stopped just outside the door. A knock followed. It was light but steady, like the knock of someone who already knew they were welcome. Her mother lifted her head, her puffy eyes darting toward the door. "Come in," she croaked. The door opened slowly and there she was, grandmother. Her cane tapped softly against the tile floor as she stepped in. Her face lined with age and wisdom was filled with a calm, steady strength. Her eyes met Mona's mother's and for a moment no words were needed. The grief in the room was thick, suffocating, but her grandmother moved through it like a ship cutting through fog. She approached the bed slowly, her eyes never leaving Mona. "My sweet baby girl," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Her knee knots bent slowly as she lowered herself into the chair on the other side of Mona's bed. Her fingers, rough but warm, brushed against Mona's cheek. "I'm here, baby, I'm here now." Her mother shook her head, her face grumbling. "She's not waking up, Mom," she sobbed. "The doctor says she's not coming back." Her grandmother's eyes narrowed, her gaze sharp as a blade. "Doctors don't know everything," she said firmly. Her voice was unshakable like stone carved from a mountain. She turned back to Mona, her hands cupping the girl's face gently, her eyes once fierce now softened with tenderness. "You hear me, baby," she said softly. "I know you hear me. You're stronger than this, stronger than you." No minutes passed, then an hour. Her grandmother stayed by her side, talking to her in that same calm, unwavering tone. Her stories drifted through the room like a lullaby. She spoke about the summers they spent baking bread together, about the time Mona learned to ride her bike, about the drawings she used to pin on the fridge. "You remember that, don't you, baby?" she said, her thumb stroking Mona's cheek. "You've always been special, you've always been my light." Her mother sat on the other side of the bed, wiping her eyes, her heart aching with every word. "And it happened. It was subtle at first, so small that it almost went unnoticed." Mona's fingers twitched, her grandmother froze, her eyes locked on the movement, her heart hard in her chest, her breath hitched. "Mona," she whispered. Her mother sat up straight, her eyes wide with shock. "Did you see that?" she gasped. Her grandmother's eyes never left Mona. "Do it again, baby," she whispered, her voice trembling with hope. "Show me you're still here." The room grew so quiet that the sound of the heart monitor felt deafening. Another twitch, then a sharp gasp. It was faint, like a breath pulled from the depths of the sea, but it was real. Her chest rose, her eyes fluttered, her mother covered her mouth, tears spilling down her face. "Oh my God," she whispered, "oh my God, she's breathing." Her father bolted for the door. "Doctor, get the doctor," he yelled down the hall. Her grandmother didn't move. She stayed exactly where she was, her hands cradling Mona's face. "That's it, baby," she whispered, her smile breaking through the tears. "That's it, come back to me." Mona's eyes opened slowly, her gaze was unfocused at first, her eyes darting around as if she didn't know where she was. Her lips parted and her breath came in shallow gasps. Her grandmother pressed her forehead against Mona's, her tears fallen freely. "You're home, baby," she whispered, "you're home." Her mother leaned over, grabbing Mona's hand, holding it to her face like it was the most precious thing she'd ever touched. "You're here," she sobbed, "you're here, you're here." Her father returned with the doctor, his eyes wide with disbelief. The doctor's eyes flicked to Mona's face, his mouth fallen open. "How's this possible?" he muttered. This shouldn't be possible." Her grandmother lifted her head, her eyes fierce as fire. "You said she wouldn't wake up," she said, her voice sharp and steady, "but you were wrong." Her gaze returned to Mona, her eyes filled with love and pride. "She's stronger than you think, she always has been." The doctors moved quickly, checking her vitals, testing her reflexes, calling for more nurses. Her parents were told to wait outside, but her grandmother stayed. She didn't move, she didn't leave, her eyes never left Mona. Hours passed before the nurses finally left the room and the doctor spoke again. "I don't have an explanation," he admitted, shaking his head, "but she's stable, her vitals are strong." Her mother pressed her face into her hands, crying with relief. Her father leaned against the wall, his eyes closed, his lips moving in silent thanks. Her grandmother sat beside Mona's bed, her eyes never leaving her granddaughter's face. "See," she said softly, brushing her hand through Mona's hair, "you fought, baby, you fought your way back." Mona's lips curved into the smallest smile, her eyes met her grandmother's, her voice was quiet, raspy, but it was clear. "I heard you," she whispered. Her grandmother's breath caught in her chest, her hands to Mona's face again, her eyes filling with tears. "I know, baby," she said softly, pressing her forehead to Mona. "I know you did." The house was quieter than usual. The soft hum of the refrigerator echoed through the kitchen as Mona sat at the dining table, her hands resting on her lap. The warmth of the sun filtered through the window, casting golden streaks of light on the wooden surface in front of her. She glanced down at her fingers, flexing them slowly as if testing whether they still work the way they used to. Her hands felt different now, every movement more deliberate, every touch more meaningful. Across from her, her grandmother sat quietly, her gaze fixed on Mona. Her eyes held no judgment, only love and patience. She sat with her hands folded, her thumbs gently circling each other. Her steady presence was like a weight keeping Mona grounded, a constant reminder that she wasn't alone. "You're thinking too hard, baby," her grandmother said softly, her voice warm but firm. Mona glanced up, her eyes filled with uncertainty. I'm just trying to figure out what happens next," Mona said, her voice voice still a little hoarse but stronger than it had been in the hospital. Her grandmother leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. What happens next? She repeated, arching one brow. What happens next is you live, baby, you live every single day like it's yours to keep. Her eyes didn't waver. You've been given something most people don't get, a second chance. Mona lowered her head, her eyes welling with terror. Her chest rose and fell with slow, steady breaths. She'd heard those words before from the nurses, from the doctors, even from her parents, but somehow hearing them from her grandmother made them feel real. It was like every word she spoke carried the weight of truth, the kind that couldn't be denied. Her grandmother reached across the table and took Mona's hands in hers, squeezing them gently. Don't be afraid to live, baby, she said. Don't let fear keep you small. Her mother entered the kitchen, drawing her hands with a dish towel. How are you feeling today, sweetheart? She asked, her eyes filled with a cautious hope. Mona shrugged, her eyes toward the window. I'm fine, she muttered, but her grandmother's gaze sharpened. Don't lie, Mona, she said softly but firmly. Not to us. Mona bit her lip, her fingers tightening around her grandmother's. I'm scared, she admitted. Her voice was barely a whisper. I don't know how to go back. Her mother knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. You don't have to go back all at once, she said gently. One step at a time, one day at a time. Her father's footsteps echoed down the hallway as he entered the kitchen, his face lightened up with a smile as he saw them all sitting together. What's all this serious talk about? He asked, pouring himself a cup of coffee. We've got to fight her in this house, don't we? He shot Mona a wink and she couldn't help but smile just a little. Her grandmother leaned back, her eyes softening as she watched them. That's right, she said, nodding slowly. This girl right here, she's stronger than she knows. She tapped her temple with one finger. She's got it up here. All she has to do is remember it. Her words lingered in the air like the smell of fresh bread, warm, familiar, and impossible to forget. The next morning the house was alive with movement. Her mother was rushing to get ready for work. Her father was halfway out the door with his keys in hand, and her grandmother was in the kitchen frying eggs. The scent of breakfast filled the air, making Mona's stomach rumble. She sat at the kitchen table, nervously picking at her fingers. Her backpack leaned against the chair leg, freshly packed with new supplies her mother had bought her over the weekend. Her grandmother set a plate of eggs and toast in front of her, sitting beside her like she always did. You ready, baby? She asked, her voice gentle but steady. Mona looked at the plate, her appetite gone. I don't know, she admitted. Her grandmother tilted her head, watching her closely. That's all right, she said. Courage ain't about being ready, it's about going anyway. Her heart thudded in her chest and her fingers curled into fists on her lap. She knew what today was. It wasn't just another day, it was the day, her first day back at school since everything had happened. Her first day facing the stares, the whispers, and the people who had made her feel so small. She thought about it all weekend, every moment filled with dread. Her grandmother reached out, resting her hand on Mona's. I'll be right here when you get back, she said firmly. No matter what happens, I'll be right here. The ride to school felt longer than usual. Every bump in the road jostled her nerves. Her mother glanced at her in the rearview mirror, her eyes filled with quiet encouragement. Remember what Grandma said, she told Mona. You don't have to be ready, you just have to go. Mona nodded, her fingers tightly gripping the strap of her backpack. The closer they got, the louder the sound of her heart became. Thud, 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 thud. When they reached the front of the school, her mother turned to face her. Do you want me to walk you in, she asked. Mona shook her head quickly, her heart racing. No, she said, her voice stronger than she expected. I have to do it alone. Her mother's eyes filled with pride. All right, baby, she said, her smile small but steady. But remember, you're not really alone. The school looked the same, the brick walls, the large metal doors, the kids laughing and chatting in small groups by the entrance. It was like nothing had changed, even though everything had changed for her. She stood by the car for a moment, her eyes locked on the door, her heart pounded in her ears, her legs refusing to move. Then she heard it, her grandmother's voice, cleared as day in her mind. Don't be afraid to live, baby. Her breath hitched. She took a step forward, then another. Her heart still pounded, her hands still shook, but her legs kept moving. She walked past the other kids, their conversations fading into background noise. Her head was up, her eyes forward. She didn't stop, she didn't flinch. When she reached the hallways, she felt the shift, eyes locked on her. Whispers floated through the air like leaves in the wind. Her heart pounded harder, but she kept moving. Her hands trembled as she reached for her locker, twisting the combination lock with steady fingers. She pulled it open, and for a moment everything felt normal. Then she heard it, the voice, the one she knew, Too well, look who's back came, sneered her voice, sharp and cold. Her two friends stood behind her, grinning like they'd just seen a new toy to break. Mona's heart jolted in her chest, but she didn't turn around. She pulled out her book gradually, her breathing consistent. Her grandma's words reverberated in her mind. You don't need to be prepared, you simply need to go. Kayla ventured nearer, her smile extended. Did they fix you at the emergency clinic, freak? She said, her voice trickling with mock pleasantness. Her companions snickered behind her, their voices like nails on glass. Mona took a sluggish full breath. Her fingers held her book firmly. She pivoted, staring at Kayla. Interestingly, she didn't turn away, she didn't recoil, she didn't run. Her chest rose with each breath. Her eyes were consistent, steady. Kayla's smile vacillated just somewhat. She seen not today, Mo said, her voice solid and firm. Her eyes didn't flicker. Her words reverberated through the corridor like thunder. Kayla shifted her head, her grin blurring. Her companions looked at one another, unexpectedly uncertain. Mona turned around to her storage, quiet and consistent. She snatched her books, shut the entryway and strolled away. Every step felt lighter than the last, every breath felt further more grounded. Interestingly, she didn't feel like a shadow on the wall, she felt such as herself. Her grandma was correct, she didn't need to be prepared. She recently had to go. The sun dunked low overhead, projecting dashes of orange and red across the skyline. Shadows extended long over the road as the cool wind murmured through the leaves of the old oak tree outside Mona's home. Inside, everything was still, too still. The murmur of the cooler hummed delicately behind the scenes, the main sound ending the weighty quiet. Mona sat at the edge of the sofa, her eyes secured on the telephone in her grasp. Her thumb floated over the screen, looking over capriciously. However, her brain wasn't centered around the thing she was seeing. Her heart was somewhere else. Her psyche was loaded up with the heaviness of each and every all that she'd been through. Her grandma sat in the rocker opposite her, look fixed on Mona, concentrating on her like she was perusing a book no one but she could comprehend. You're outrageously calm, child, her grandma said, her voice delicate yet understanding. What's happening in the head of yours? Mona shrugged, not turning upward from her telephone. Nothing, she murmured. Her grandma inclined forward, laying her elbows, kneeling down, her eyes sharp once more. Consistent. Don't deceive me, Mona, she said delicately. I realize you excessively well. Mona's fingers fixed around the telephone. Her heart ached with the heaviness of everything she'd been holding, and she looked up at her grandma, her eyes lustrous with tears she wouldn't let fall. I'm drained, grandmother, she said, her voice breaking. I'm so fed up with attempting to areas of strength for the time I'm burnt out on imagining I'm okay when I'm not. Her chest hurled as she retaliated the tears. I'm worn out. Her grandma got up leisurely, her stick tapping delicately against the floor. She strolled over each step intentionally, each development loaded up with reason. She sat close to Mona on the love seat, folding her arm over her shoulder. Goodness, child, she said delicately, pulling Mona close. Ain't nothing bad about being worn out. Even the most grounded trees curve in the breeze at times. Her hand scoured sluggish, alleviating circles on Mona's back. However, you're still here, aren't you? Actually breathing, actually battling? Mona inclined into her grandma's glow, letting the consistent thump of her heart quiet the tempest inside her. I'm attempting, Mona murmured, her voice little and delicate. Her grandma kissed the highest point of her head, her lips delicate against her hair. That is everything you can do, child, she said. Also, that is sufficient. That evening after supper the house developed calm again. Her folks had gone to bed early, depleted from work. Her grandma sat in the kitchen tasting tea while murmuring an old tune. Mona found a seat at the table opposite her, her head laying on her hand as she gazed through the window. The street lamps glimmered external, the shine faint however consistent. Her eyes felt weighty, her body depleted, yet her psyche wouldn't quit dashing. Her grandma's murmuring developed gentler, then it halted. Mona looked over and saw her grandma's eyes rippling shut, her head shifting forward. Grandmother, Mona said, her heart skirting a beat. Her grandma didn't answer, her body inclined forward, her teacup slipping from her hands and breaking on the floor. Grandmother, Mona shot up, hurrying to her side. She got her grandma's shoulders, shaking her delicately. Grandmother, awaken, kindly wake up. Her voice broke with alarm, her breath coming in short, sharp wheezes. Her grandma's head shifted back, her eyes scarcely open, her breathing shallow. Mona's heart beat in her chest, her hands shook as she bungled for her telephone. Her fingers felt numb, awkward as she dialed 911. Kindly please, she murmured to herself, her voice shaking as she squeezed the telephone to her ear. The line rang once, 2 times, then a quiet voice addressed 911. What's your crisis? It's my grandmother, Mona wheezed, destroys running her face. She's not breathing right, she's not awakening. If it's not too much trouble, "Send somebody please." Her voice broken into a cry. She could hear the dispatcher's quiet voice on the opposite end requesting the dress, telling her assistance was on the way, yet the words felt far off, like they were coming from submerged. Mona's eyes remained on her grandma, her chest hurling as she watched her breathing become more slow, shallower. Her heart felt like it planned to break. Her hands floated over her grandma's chest, uncertain what to do, reluctant to do the wrong thing. "Come on, grandmother," she murmured, her voice loaded up with distress. "You said I was solid. You said I could battle. You need to battle as well. Kindly don't leave me." Her tears dribbled onto her grandma's face, and briefly the world felt like it had quit turning. The sound of alarms broke through the quietness. Red and blue lights streaked through the window, moving across the walls. Mona heard the shriek of tires outside, the bang of vehicle in treeways where here somebody got down on weighty strides, beat up the patio steps, and the front entryway flew open. Two paramedics hurried inside, their eyes filtering the room until they saw Mona and her grandma. "Clear out, darling," one of them said, his voice firm yet kind. Mona staggered back, her heart dashing as she observed them work. They moved rapidly, their hands consistent, their voices intelligible as they called out numbers and guidelines to one another. One of them checked her grandma's heartbeat, his forehead wrinkled, the other arranged the defibrillator. Mona's eyes extended as she watched them put the cushions on her grandma's chest. "Clear." The paramedic got down on Mona, jumped as the shock of power went through her grandma's body. Her body jolted once, then fell still again. "Come on," the paramedic murmured faintly. "Come on." They attempted once more. Another shock, another respite, still no heartbeat. One of them said, "Prep the oxygen." "No," Mona shouted out, venturing forward. Her entire body shook as she gazed at her grandma. Her breath came in sharp, shallow heaves. "She's not gone. She's not gone." Her voice reverberated through the room like thunder. Her legs felt frail and she dropped to her knees, her hands squeezed to her chest. "You can't abandon her," she shouted. "You can't. She never abandoned me." Tears streamed down her face as she inclined forward, grasping her grandma's hand, her fingers crushed firmly, her heart beating so hard it seemed like it would burst. "Grandmother, please," she wailed, her entire body shaking. "Kindly don't leave me." "Satisfy." Her voice broke, crude with torment. Her attacks her grandma's skin. Then it happened, a delicate breath, scarcely a sound, however Mona heard it. Her eyes shot open, her breath getting in her throat. "Stand by," she yelled. "She's breathing." The paramedics froze, their eyes snapping to her grandma's face. They inclined and watching her chest rise gradually, consistently. One of them, "Really look at her," beat, his eyes going wide. "We have a heartbeat." He got back to out. "She's Mona." Covered her mouth, her eyes loading up with tears. Help, shock and bliss all hit her on the double. Her knees gave out and she sat back on the floor, her body shudder. "Grandmother," she murmured, her heart beating with doubt. Her grandma's eyes opened gradually, feeble however alive, her look locked onto Mona. Her lips moved gradually, the slightest murmur getting away from her mouth. "Let you know I'm not finished." At this point her words were faint, yet Mona heard them as undeniable. A wail got away from her lips as she covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook with the power of her cries. However, this time it wasn't bitterness, it was trust, it was happiness. The paramedics worked rapidly, balancing out her grandma and setting up her for transport, yet none of that made a difference to Mona. All she could see was her grandma's eyes open and taking a gander at her later as they sat toward the rear of the emergency vehicle. Mona held her grandma's hand the whole ride. The alarms boomed above, yet it felt like harmony had settled over her heart. Her grandma pressed her hand, her eyes tired yet loaded up proudly. "You battled for me," her grandma murmured. Mona gestured, her tears falling unreservedly. "I gained from the best," she said, her voice shaking with feeling. Her grandma grinned delicately, her eyes shutting as she floated into a light rest. Mona reclined, her eyes gazing at the glimmering red lights on the roof. Her heart was all the while hustling her body actually shudder. However, without precedent, for quite a while she felt something different. She felt solid. What an excursion it has been. Nevertheless, this is only the starting. Assuming that this story moved you, try to like, remark and buy into the channel. Your help permits us to keep bringing strong stories like this one to life. Share your considerations in the remarks, we'd very much want to hear from you. See you in the following one.